The cold arrived without sound. That was the first thing Thomas Calder noticed, even before the pain in his lungs. At 90 years old, Thomas had lived through wars, depressions, and the slow death of entire towns across rural America. But nothing had ever felt like this. The thermometer nailed crookedly outside the cabin window no longer showed numbers. The red line had sunk so low it had vanished into the metal casing itself. Later, experts would say the temperature that night reached -71 degrees Celsius, one of the coldest ever recorded in the continental United States. But Thomas did not need experts. His bones already knew. Beside him, wrapped in 3 wool blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and age, lay his wife, Margaret Calder. She was 89, her hair thin and white as frost, her hands permanently curled from arthritis. She slept lightly, the way people do when survival depends on waking quickly. They had learned that habit decades ago, back when Alaska still felt like a frontier and not a graveyard of abandoned dreams. The cabin groaned under the pressure of the cold. Wood popped sharply like distant gunshots. Outside, the wind scraped across the frozen tundra, carrying snow so fine it slipped through the smallest cracks. Somewhere beyond the darkness, something howled. Margaret's eyes opened. "You hear that?" she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly, speaking wasted heat. "Wolves," he said after a moment. His voice sounded brittle, like paper being folded too many times. They had heard wolves before. Everyone who lived this far north had. But this was different. This was not a single hunting call or a distant warning cry. This was many voices, layered together, rising and falling in a way that tightened the chest. Hunger had brought them closer than usual. The Calders had not planned to be here this winter. They had lived in this cabin for over 50 years, back when Thomas worked maintenance for a remote weather station that no longer existed. When retirement came, people asked why they didn't move south like everyone else. Florida, Arizona, anywhere warm. Thomas always smiled and said, "Cold keeps you honest." Margaret would add, "And it keeps people away." But age is a quiet enemy. Supplies run out faster. Strength disappears without warning. That autumn, an early storm destroyed the radio tower miles away, cutting off communication. Then another storm collapsed the old supply bridge over the river. By the time they realized help would not come before winter, the ground had already frozen solid. They decided to stay. Leaving would have meant walking nearly 40 miles through the wilderness in rapidly dropping temperatures. Staying meant trusting the cabin, their memories, and each other. That night, the cold tested that decision. Thomas forced himself upright, every joint protesting. He pulled on his boots, still stiff from yesterday's ice. Margaret sat up slowly, clutching her chest until the ache passed. She reached for her coat. "No," Thomas said softly. "Stay covered." He shuffled toward the stove. The fire had burned low, only a few stubborn embers glowing. He fed it the last of the birch logs they'd been saving, hands shaking as sparks leapt. The warmth crept back inch by inch. Never enough. Another howl came, closer this time. Margaret counted silently. 1, 2, 3. At least 6 voices. "They're circling," she said. Thomas didn't answer. He already knew. The wolves had learned the shape of the cabin. They had learned that 2 slow, fragile creatures lived inside. Hunger erased fear, and winter made teachers of predators. A heavy thump struck the far wall, then another. Snow slid from the roof in a powdery cascade as something brushed against the logs. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle mounted above the door. It was old, bolt action, the bluing worn thin. He had cleaned it every week for decades. Habit outlived necessity. Margaret moved closer to him, her hand slipping into his. Her skin was cold, even inside the cabin. "Remember the winter of '63? She asked quietly. Thomas smiled beside himself. "You burned the stew. You said it tasted fine." "I lied." Another impact rattled the window. The wolves were testing. Thomas raised the rifle and aimed at the door, knowing full well that wood would not stop a determined pack forever. He had killed animals before, for food, for defense. But killing in this cold was different. Blood froze quickly. Meat shattered like glass. Nothing felt natural at -71. Suddenly, silence fell. That silence frightened him more than the howling. Predators were thinking. Minutes stretched. Margaret's breathing slowed as she conserved energy. The stove crackled weakly. Frost crept along the inside walls, white veins spreading like a disease. Then came a sound neither of them expected. A deep, heavy snort. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Wolves did not make that sound. Something large moved outside, its weight pressing into the snow with a slow, deliberate confidence. The wolves whined softly now, not hunting cries, but nervous ones. Margaret's eyes opened. "That's not, I know," Thomas said. A polar bear had wandered far south, driven by desperation and shrinking ice. It was rare, but not impossible. And at -71, nothing behaved normally. The cabin shuddered as the bear brushed against it, curious, massive. Its breath steamed against the logs. One swipe of those claws could tear through wood like paper. Thomas realized then that this fight was not about strength. It was about time. They needed to survive the night. He lowered the rifle. Shooting the bear would only anger it unless the shot was perfect, and his hands were not steady enough anymore. Instead, he grabbed the emergency flares stored under the table, relics from his weather station days. Margaret instantly understood. She dragged herself toward the far wall, banging a metal pan against the logs, making noise, confusing the predators. Thomas struck the flare. A violent red light exploded into the cabin, hissing and spitting. Heat bloomed against his face. He threw the flare through a small opening near the door, where cold rushed in like a living thing. Outside, chaos erupted. The wolves scattered, yelping. The bear roared, a sound so deep it vibrated through Thomas's chest. Snow flashed red and orange as the flare burned, smoke curling into the frozen air. The bear backed away, more annoyed than afraid, but enough. Enough for now. Thomas slammed the opening shut and leaned against the door, chest heaving. Margaret collapsed beside him, her strength spent. They sat there in the flickering firelight, knowing this was only the beginning, because the cold was not leaving, and neither were the predators. As the night stretched on, Thomas realized something terrifyingly clear. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They were waiting to see which would give out first, the winter or them. And winter was never known to surrender. The flare burned itself out in the snow within minutes, but its memory lingered in the air like the echo of a scream. Outside, the night returned to its natural state, dark, brutal, and patient. Thomas remained pressed against the door long after the noise faded, listening for anything that might signal a second attack. His ears rang with silence so complete it felt artificial. Margaret sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to steady herself. At this temperature, sleep could kill you. The cold had a way of sneaking in quietly, dulling fear, softening thought, until the body simply stopped fighting. "We used one flare," she said eventually. Thomas nodded. 2 left. They had once had a full box. Years ago, during a winter storm, a bush plane had crashed 20 miles north of them. Thomas and 2 other men had followed the smoke and found the wreckage half buried in snow. No survivors. They used flares then, too, signals that no one answered. After that, Thomas kept the rest stored away, just in case. Just in case had arrived. The stove crackled, then went quiet again. The birch logs were almost gone. Thomas fed the fire a sliver of wood, hating how small it looked once the flame caught. Fire in this cold was not warmth, it was resistance, and resistance cost fuel. Margaret rose slowly and moved toward the window, peering through the frost-laced glass. She wiped a small circle clear with her sleeve. Outside, moonlight reflected off endless white, broken only by the dark shapes of trees and something else. Tracks. Fresh. Large paw prints pressed deep into the snow, circling the cabin. Some overlapped, some faded where drifting snow tried to erase them. Wolves, and larger ones, wider apart. "The bear's still here," she said. Thomas joined her, leaning heavily on the table. He followed the trail with his eyes. The bear had walked around the cabin twice, maybe 3 times, leaving scent marks where it could reach. Not attacking, claiming. "It thinks this is food," he said. Margaret looked at him. "We are food." The words hung between them, simple and terrible. They retreated from the window. Cold seeped through the glass faster than they could fight it. Margaret wrapped another scarf around her neck. Her fingers were losing color, turning pale and stiff. "Your hands," Thomas said. "I know." He took them gently, rubbing warmth into them despite his own aching joints. Their skin was thin now, veins like blue threads beneath paper. He had held these hands for nearly 70 years, in sickness, in joy, in moments far quieter than this. He wondered, not for the first time, if this would be the last place he ever touched them. A low scraping sound came from the roof. Snow fell in a soft avalanche as something heavy shifted its weight above them. The cabin creaked, protesting. "It climbed," Margaret swallowed. "Just testing," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure. Polar bears were intelligent, curious, persistent. They waited. Minutes passed, an hour maybe, more. Time lost meaning when survival was measured in breaths. The temperature inside the cabin continued to drop, despite the fire. Frost spread across the floorboards now, slick and dangerous. Thomas's mind drifted, unbidden, to memories, not of youth, but of small moments, teaching Margaret to shoot, her laughing when the rifle nearly knocked her over. Their first winter here, the cabin still new, the cold exciting instead of threatening. Back then, they believed experience made them invincible. The scraping stopped. Then came a sound that made Thomas's heart pound harder than any roar. Sniffing. Right at the door. The bear's nose pushed against the wood, inhaling deeply. Its breath leaked through the cracks, carrying a smell Thomas recognized instantly. Rotting fish, damp fur, and raw power. The door bowed inward slightly. Margaret reached for the rifle, her hands shaking violently now, not from fear alone, but from the cold stealing her strength. Thomas placed his hand over hers. "We not yet," he whispered. If the bear broke in, a rifle shot would only be useful at point-blank range, and even then not guaranteed. Their best defense was deterrence, confusion, anything to convince the animal that the effort wasn't worth the reward. Morning did not bring relief. It brought clarity. A pale, lifeless light seeped through the frost-covered windows, revealing what the darkness had hidden. The cabin looked smaller in daylight, more fragile. Hairline cracks traced the walls like veins beneath aging skin. Ice had formed along the ceiling where warm air once rose. The stove sat cold and black, a dead thing. Thomas woke first, his body stiff, his thoughts slow. For a moment he could not feel his legs. Panic surged, sharp and immediate, until pins and needles screamed back into existence. He forced himself to move, even as pain tore through his joints. Margaret lay against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Thank God. Outside, the world was silent again, not peaceful, watchful. Thomas eased himself upright and peered through the window. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a landscape frozen into absolute stillness. Tracks were everywhere now. The wolves had not left. They had simply waited. The bear's prints cut through them all, larger, heavier, leading away from the cabin toward the tree line, and then circling back. It had not gone far. Margaret stirred. Is it morning? Yes. Her eyes opened slowly. She tried to sit up and winced. I can't feel my feet. Thomas didn't answer right away. He knew what that meant. Frostbite had a way of disguising itself at first, numbing before it destroyed. He pulled back the blankets and examined her boots. Ice crusted the leather. When he touched her toes through her socks, she didn't react. His throat tightened. We need heat, now. They had one option left. The cabin had been built sturdy, but over the years, Thomas had added shelves, furniture, small comforts that now stood between them and survival. He took the axe from its hook, its handle worn smooth by decades of use, and walked to the old wooden table where they had eaten thousands of meals together. Margaret watched, understanding immediately. That was your father's. I know. He raised the axe and brought it down. The crack echoed sharply through the cabin. Wood split cleanly, exposing dry interior grain. He worked methodically, conserving energy, breaking the table into pieces small enough to burn. When he fed them into the stove and struck a spark, the flame caught eagerly, as if starved. Heat returned, weak but real. Margaret exhaled a shaky breath. You always said we'd burn this place down one day. Thomas managed a faint smile. Didn't think it'd be piece by piece. As the fire grew, sensation crept back into Margaret's feet, first as pain, then as a deep, relentless ache. She cried out despite herself. Thomas held her, letting her grip his arm until her nails dug into his skin. Outside, movement caught his eye. The wolves had drawn closer again, their shapes dark against the white. They moved with confidence now, no longer keeping their distance. Hunger sharpened their intelligence. One wolf stepped forward, larger than the rest, its fur mottled with scars. It stared directly at the window, eyes pale and unblinking. Thomas felt something twist inside him. It was not fear, it was recognition. Predators understood weakness. The bear appeared moments later, lumbering into view from the trees. Its massive head swung back and forth as it caught their scent. It stopped a short distance from the cabin and sat back on its haunches, waiting. Margaret followed Thomas's gaze. Her voice trembled. "It's not leaving." "No," he said, "it's conserving energy." So were they. By midday, the fire burned low again. There was little left to sacrifice. A chair, a shelf, old books they had once treasured. Each item fed to the flames felt like erasing a piece of their lives. The wind picked up in the afternoon, bringing with it a new storm. Snow lashed against the windows, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The predators faded from sight, but Thomas knew better than to believe they were gone. As evening approached, Margaret's condition worsened. Her shivering returned, violent and uncontrollable. Her speech slurred. "Tom," she whispered, "if it comes to it." He shook his head. "Don't." But she thought we both knew what she meant. The rifle lay between them now, cleaned, loaded. One bullet left. Not for the bear, for mercy. The first impact came just after nightfall. The wolves attacked together this time, throwing their weight against the cabin walls. Claws tore at wood already weakened by cold. Teeth snapped and scraped. The sound was relentless, surrounding them. Thomas fired a warning shot through the door. The crack echoed across the frozen land. The wolves scattered briefly, but not far. Hunger pushed them back quickly. Then the bear joined in. The cabin shook violently as the massive animal slammed into one wall, then another. Wood splintered. A section near the corner caved inward, snow pouring inside in a blinding rush of cold. Thomas grabbed the last flare. Margaret clutched his arm. "If you use it." "I know." He lit it anyway. The red light flared to life, brighter than before in the darkness. Thomas hurled it through the collapsing wall. The explosion of color and heat startled the wolves into retreat once more. The bear roared in fury, backing away, its patience finally cracking. But when the flare burned out, something terrifying happened. The bear did not leave. It stood there, steaming in the cold, staring at the cabin. It had learned. Fire hurt, but it was temporary. Margaret leaned against Thomas, her strength nearly gone. "Tom," she whispered, "I'm so tired." He held her face in his hands, pressing his forehead to hers. "Stay with me," he whispered, "just a little longer." Outside, the predators settled in. They were no longer testing. They were waiting for the cold to finish the job. The cold stopped feeling sharp some time after midnight. Thomas noticed it slowly, the way a man notices the tide pulling him out to sea only when his feet no longer touch the sand. The pain dulled first, then the urgency, then the fear. What remained was exhaustion so deep it felt like gravity itself had increased. That terrified him more than the wolves. Margaret lay motionless against his chest, her breathing shallow, each rise and fall barely perceptible. Her eyes were half open now, unfocused, reflecting the weak orange glow of the fire that was eating the last scraps of their lives. Splintered chair legs, broken shelves, the final pieces of the table. Outside, the storm had calmed again. Predators understood stillness. Thomas could hear them clearly now, the soft crunch of paws shifting in snow, the occasional low growl, the bear's heavy breathing, slow and deliberate, like something sleeping just outside a door. He reached down and felt Margaret's hand. It was colder than it should have been. "Margaret," he whispered. No response. He pressed his ear to her chest. Her heart still beat, but faintly, like a drum heard from very far away. Panic surged, burning through the fog in his mind. "No," he said aloud, forcing the word into the freezing air. "Not yet." He knew what came next if he did nothing. Hypothermia didn't kill violently. It seduced. It made you want to rest, to close your eyes, to let go. He had seen it before, years ago, when a young surveyor got lost during a whiteout. They found the man sitting peacefully against a tree, boots neatly placed beside him, jacket unzipped. Thomas would not let that happen to her. With shaking hands, he pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around Margaret, then pressed her feet against his stomach, sharing every last bit of heat he had. His own teeth chattered uncontrollably now, his vision blurred at the edges. "Stay," he murmured again and again. "You stay." Outside, the wolves began to howl, not the hunting call, but something different, a drawn-out sound that rose and fell like a warning. The bear answered. A deep, rolling growl shook snow from the trees. The animals were closing in. Thomas knew the cabin would not hold much longer. The walls had already begun to bow inward where the bear had struck. One more coordinated push and the predators would be inside, and then it would be fast. He looked down at Margaret's face, pale and still, the lines he loved softened by cold. 70 years of memories pressed into that moment, weddings, funerals, laughter echoing off these same walls decades earlier. He made a decision. Slowly, painfully, Thomas stood. Every instinct screamed at him to sit back down, to conserve what little strength remained. But survival had never been about comfort. It was about action, even when action hurt. He took the rifle. The single remaining bullet glinted faintly. Thomas moved to the door. His fingers struggled with the latch, stiff and clumsy. Cold air leaked through the cracks, stealing breath from his lungs. He looked back once. Margaret did not move. "I'll be right back," he whispered, though he knew she could not hear him. When he opened the door, the world exploded into motion. The wolves surged forward, teeth bared, eyes wild. The bear rose onto its hind legs, towering above them all, massive and unstoppable. Thomas raised the rifle and fired. The shot was not aimed at the animals. He fired into the air. The sound ripped across the frozen land, echoing through the valley like thunder. Birds burst from the trees. The wolves scattered instinctively, their training overpowering hunger for just a moment. Then Thomas did something no one expected. He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. -71 degrees clawed into his lungs, freezing the moisture in his breath instantly. His legs nearly gave out, but he forced himself forward, standing between the predators and the cabin. He shouted. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a sound that made sense. It was raw defiance, torn from a body that had nothing left to give. The wolves hesitated. The bear stared at him, head tilted slightly, curious. Thomas raised his arms, making himself larger, though he felt impossibly small. His heart hammered painfully in his chest. His vision tunneled. This was not bravery. This was stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had kept him alive through decades of Alaskan winters. The same stubbornness that built that cabin, repaired it 100 times, and kept 2 old people alive long past when nature had expected them to quit. A distant sound cut through the frozen air. At first, Thomas thought it was the wind. Then the sound sharpened, rhythmic and mechanical. An engine. The bear froze. The wolves scattered instinctively, their fear overriding hunger. Lights appeared through the trees, bright, artificial, moving. A snowcat broke into the clearing, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Behind it, another followed. Men shouted. Flares ignited, not the small emergency kind Thomas had used, but powerful, blazing signals that turned night into day. The bear retreated, grumbling in frustration, disappearing into the trees. The wolves vanished after it. Thomas felt his knees buckle. Hands caught him before he hit the ground. Voices blurred together. Words lost meaning. He tried to speak. "My wife," he managed. "Inside." They carried him back into the cabin. Margaret. A medic knelt beside her, working quickly, wrapping her, checking her pulse. "She's alive," someone said. Thomas closed his eyes. He woke up days later in a warm room that smelled of antiseptic and clean sheets. Machines hummed softly around him. Margaret lay in the bed beside his. She was thinner, weaker, but her eyes were open now. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. "You always picked the worst times to go for a walk," she whispered. Thomas laughed, a sound that turned into a sob halfway through. He reached for her hand, warm now, truly warm. Outside the window, snow fell gently. The cabin did not survive. Rescuers later said it would have collapsed within hours. But 2 people did. At 90 years old, against predators, against minus 71 degrees, against time itself, Thomas and Margaret Calder had refused to disappear quietly. And sometimes that refusal is enough.